In the scorching summer of 1876, in a small frontier town called Redemption Creek, nestled in the dusty plains of Texas, a moment occurred that would shake the foundations of an entire community and force people to confront the ugly truths they had been hiding behind polite smiles and Sunday sermons. A young black girl named Sarah Mitchell stood in the middle of the town square on a blazing afternoon, her voice trembling as she pleaded with a white rancher to stop what he was doing, words that would echo through history and ignite a firestorm of controversy that threatened to tear the town apart. The rancher, a man named William Hayes who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, did not stop despite her desperate pleas, and what happened next would become a story whispered about for generations, a tale that exposed the deep wounds of prejudice and the extraordinary courage it took to stand up for what was right in a time and place where doing so could cost you everything. The town of Redemption Creek had been founded just 10 years earlier by settlers hoping to build a new life after the Civil War, and like many frontier communities, it was a complicated mix of people trying to escape their pasts and create better futures. There were former Confederate soldiers and Union veterans living side by side, former slaves who had gained their freedom and white families who still clung to old attitudes about race and power. The town had an unwritten code that everyone understood, rules about who could go where and who could speak to whom, invisible lines that divided the community as surely as any physical wall. Sarah Mitchell and her family lived on the edge of town in a small house her father had built with his own hands, and they followed those unwritten rules carefully because they knew that crossing the wrong line could bring danger to their door. But on that hot summer day, Sarah would be forced to make a choice between staying silent to protect herself or speaking up to protect something even more important, and her decision would change everything. Sarah Mitchell was 14 years old in the summer of 1876, a bright and curious girl who loved to read and dreamed of becoming a teacher someday. She had been born into slavery in Louisiana in 1862, during the darkest days of the Civil War, and though she was too young to remember much of that time, her parents had told her stories about what life had been like before freedom came. Her father, Joshua Mitchell, had been a field hand on a cotton plantation, working from dawn until dark under the burning sun and the watchful eyes of overseers with whips. Her mother, Grace Mitchell, had worked in the plantation house, cooking and cleaning and raising the white children while barely getting to see her own daughter. When the war ended and freedom came, Joshua and Grace had left Louisiana with their little girl, walking hundreds of miles until they reached Texas and found a place where they could start over. In Redemption Creek, Joshua found work as a blacksmith, a skill he had learned in slavery and now could use to earn money for his own family. He was good at his work, able to shoe horses and repair tools and make iron goods that people needed, and slowly he built up enough business to support his family. Grace took in laundry and sewing, working long hours to add to their income, and together they saved every penny they could. They bought a small piece of land on the outskirts of town and built a simple house with 2 rooms, and to them, it felt like a palace because it belonged to them and no one could take it away. They raised Sarah to be respectful and hardworking, to keep her head down and not cause trouble, but they also taught her to read and write, skills that many black children in that time never got to learn. They told her that education was the key to a better future, that knowledge was something no one could take from her no matter what happened. Sarah attended the small schoolhouse for black children that met in the back of the church, taught by a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had been educated before the war by the family that had enslaved her. Sarah loved learning, soaking up every lesson like dry earth soaking up rain. She read every book she could get her hands on, borrowing from Mrs. Patterson's small collection, and sometimes sneaking peeks at newspapers that white folks left behind. She dreamed of going to one of the new colleges for black students that were being founded in the South, of becoming a teacher herself and helping other children learn. Her parents encouraged her dreams while also warning her to be careful, reminding her that the world was still a dangerous place for black people, especially black people who seemed too educated or ambitious. Sarah understood the warnings, but she also believed that things were changing, that freedom meant something real, and that if she worked hard enough she could build the life she wanted. William Hayes was the most powerful man in Redemption Creek and the surrounding county, a cattle baron who had built his fortune through a combination of hard work, smart business decisions, and ruthless elimination of anyone who got in his way. He had come to Texas right after the Civil War with nothing but a horse and a dream, and through determination and calculated risks, he had assembled a cattle empire that stretched across thousands of acres. He employed dozens of cowboys and controlled water rights that other ranchers depended on, giving him power over who succeeded and who failed in the area. People in town treated him with respect that was really fear, knowing that crossing William Hayes could mean losing your job or your credit at the store or worse. Hayes was not the worst of men by the standards of his time, but he was a product of that time with all its prejudices and blind spots. He had fought for the Confederacy during the war and still believed in a social order where white men like himself sat at the top and everyone else knew their place below. He was not openly cruel to the black families in town, but he made it clear through his actions and his words that he did not consider them his equals. He paid black workers less than white workers for the same jobs, spoke to them in a tone that dripped with condescension, and expected them to step off the sidewalk when he passed. Most people in Redemption Creek went along with his attitudes because he had the power to make their lives difficult if they did not, and because many of them shared those same prejudices even if they were not as wealthy or influential. Hayes had a son named Thomas who was 16 years old, and the boy had inherited his father's sense of entitlement without developing any of his father's business sense or work ethic. Thomas was spoiled and lazy, used to getting whatever he wanted because of his father's money and power. He spent his days riding around town, causing minor trouble, harassing people he considered beneath him, and generally acting like the rules that applied to everyone else did not apply to him. His father mostly ignored his behavior, too busy running his cattle empire to pay much attention to what his son was doing, and the townspeople were too afraid of William Hayes to discipline his boy. Thomas had noticed Sarah Mitchell around town, and he had started following her and making comments that made her uncomfortable. But Sarah tried to ignore him and stay out of his way, knowing that complaining about the son of the most powerful man in town would only bring trouble to her family. The thing that Sarah wanted most in the world was access to books, more books than Mrs. Patterson's small collection could provide. She had heard that some towns had public libraries where anyone could go and read whatever they wanted, and she dreamed of Redemption Creek having such a place. When she learned that the town council was discussing whether to use some tax money to establish a small library in the town hall, Sarah's heart soared with hope. She talked to Mrs. Patterson about it, and the older woman encouraged her to attend the town council meeting and speak in favor of the library, saying that even though it would be scary, sometimes people needed to hear from those who would benefit most from such an institution. Sarah prepared carefully for the meeting, writing out what she wanted to say and practicing it until she had it memorized. She talked to her parents about going, and they were worried, afraid that speaking up at a public meeting dominated by white men would draw the wrong kind of attention to their family. But they also saw the hope shining in their daughter's eyes, and they could not bring themselves to crush that hope. They agreed to let her go, with her father accompanying her to the meeting, and they prayed that nothing bad would come from it. On the night of the meeting, Sarah put on her best dress, the one her mother had made from fabric they had saved for months to buy, and she walked into the town hall with her head high and her stomach full of butterflies. The town hall was packed with people, mostly white ranchers and business owners, who had come to discuss various issues affecting the town. When the topic of the library came up, several people spoke in favor of it, saying it would bring culture and learning to Redemption Creek and help educate the next generation. A few spoke against it, arguing that it was a waste of tax money that could be better spent on roads or law enforcement. Then Sarah raised her hand and asked if she could speak, and the room went quiet. People turned to stare at this young black girl, who had the audacity to think her opinion mattered at a town council meeting. And Sarah felt every eye on her like a physical weight. But she stood up anyway, and in a voice that shook only a little, she spoke about what books had meant to her, how they had opened up worlds she never knew existed and given her dreams of what she might become. She talked about how a library would benefit all the children in town, black and white, and how education was the foundation of progress and civilization. Sarah's speech at the town meeting had mixed results. Some people were moved by her eloquence and sincerity, surprised that a black girl could speak so well and express such thoughtful ideas. Others were offended that she had dared to speak at all, muttering that she was getting above her station and that someone needed to remind her of her place. The town council voted to approve the library, but Sarah could not shake the feeling that she had made a mistake, that she had drawn attention to herself in a way that might bring consequences. Her father felt it too, and he warned her to be extra careful in the coming days, to avoid going anywhere alone and to come straight home from school. Thomas Hayes had been at that town meeting with his father, and he had watched Sarah speak with a mixture of fascination and anger. He was fascinated because he had never heard a black person speak like that, with such confidence and intelligence, and it challenged everything he had been taught about black people being inferior. But he was also angry because her speech had made him feel small and stupid by comparison, and he did not like that feeling at all. He started following Sarah more often, showing up places where he knew she would be, making comments that grew increasingly nasty. Sarah tried to ignore him, but it was getting harder, and she was getting scared. The situation came to a head one afternoon in late July when Sarah was walking home from the general store where she had picked up some supplies for her mother. The street was mostly empty because it was the hottest part of the day, and most sensible people were inside staying cool. Thomas Hayes appeared seemingly out of nowhere, blocking her path on the wooden sidewalk. He started saying terrible things to her, crude comments that made her face burn with shame and fear. Sarah tried to walk around him, but he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. That was when Sarah said the words that would become famous, her voice loud enough that people in nearby buildings could hear her through their open windows. She said please stop, that what he was doing was forbidden, that he needed to let her go right now. William Hayes had been coming out of the bank across the street when he heard his son's name being called out in distress. He looked over and saw Thomas grabbing the arm of the Mitchell girl, saw the fear on her face and the anger on his son's face, and he knew instantly that this was a moment that mattered. Everything he did in the next few minutes would have consequences that rippled far beyond this single incident. The old William Hayes, the man he had been before the war, might have looked away or even laughed it off as boys being boys. But William Hayes had seen things during the war that had changed him in ways he rarely admitted, had watched men die for causes they barely understood, had seen the cost of hatred and violence up close. He had built his fortune in the aftermath of that war, and he knew that the world was changing whether people like him wanted it to or not. Hayes crossed the street with long strides, his boots loud on the wooden sidewalk, and people who saw him coming moved out of his way because everyone knew you did not want to be in William Hayes's path when he was moving with purpose. Thomas saw his father approaching and smiled, expecting approval or at least indifference to what he was doing. But instead, William Hayes grabbed his son's wrist and squeezed until Thomas released Sarah's arm with a yelp of pain and surprise. Hayes told his son in a voice that carried up and down the street that he would not tolerate this behavior, that grabbing a young girl against her will was the act of a coward and a bully, and that no son of his was going to act that way in this town or anywhere else. The words hung in the air like thunder, and people who had heard them through windows and doorways came outside to see what was happening. They could not believe what they were witnessing. William Hayes, the most powerful man in the county, a former Confederate soldier who had never shown much sympathy for black people, was defending a black girl against his own son. Hayes turned to Sarah and asked if she was hurt, and when she shook her head no, still too shocked to speak, he told her to go on home and not to worry, that this would not happen again. Then he grabbed his son by the collar and marched him down the street toward their ranch house on the edge of town. And everyone who saw it knew that Thomas Hayes was about to face his father's wrath in a way he never had before. By evening, everyone in Redemption Creek had heard about what happened on the main street, and the town was buzzing with conversation and argument. Some people praised William Hayes for standing up for what was right, saying it took real courage to discipline your own son in public like that, especially when it meant defending someone most folks considered beneath their concern. These people said Hayes had shown true character, and that maybe there was hope for change in how black people were treated if even someone like him could do the right thing. They gathered in small groups and talked about how maybe it was time to start treating the black families in town with more respect, to acknowledge that they were human beings deserving of basic dignity and protection under the law. But other people in town had a very different reaction, and their anger was loud and ugly. They gathered in the saloons and on street corners, saying that William Hayes had betrayed his own kind, that he had humiliated his son to defend a black girl who probably had provoked Thomas anyway. They muttered that Hayes must be getting soft in his old age, that he had forgotten the proper order of things, that next thing you knew black people would be thinking they were equal to whites and demanding to eat in the same restaurants and attend the same schools. These were the people who had never accepted that slavery was over, who resented every bit of progress black people made, who wanted to keep the old ways alive no matter what the law said about freedom and equality. The black community in Redemption Creek was terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Joshua and Grace Mitchell were grateful that Hayes had intervened to protect their daughter, but they were also deeply worried about what might come next. They knew that some white people in town would be angry about what happened, and anger in white people had a way of turning into violence against black people, even when black people had done nothing wrong. Other black families came to visit the Mitchells that evening, everyone talking in hushed voices about what this meant and what they should do. Should they keep their heads down and hope the anger blew over, or should they stand up and demand that the respect Hayes had shown Sarah be extended to all of them? It was a dangerous question with no easy answer, and the fear in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. In the days following the incident, Sarah became the center of attention in a way she had never wanted or asked for. Some white people in town looked at her with new respect, nodding to her on the street and treating her like a real person, instead of someone to be ignored or talked down to. But others looked at her with hatred, blaming her for causing trouble and stirring up conflict in a town that had been peaceful before she got uppity. Sarah received threats, notes left at her house warning her that she better watch herself, that there were people who did not appreciate what she had done and who might decide to teach her a lesson. Her parents wanted her to stay home where it was safe, but Sarah refused to hide, saying that she had done nothing wrong and she would not let fear control her life. Mrs. Patterson called a special meeting at the church for all the black families in town, and more than 50 people crowded into the small building on a hot evening to talk about what was happening. Some people argued that they needed to be more careful than ever, that Hayes's actions had stirred up a hornet's nest, and they would all be targets if they were not cautious. Others said this was an opportunity, that if someone as powerful as William Hayes was willing to stand up for them, then maybe it was time to push for real changes in how they were treated. Sarah stood up and spoke, her voice stronger than it had been at the town council meeting, because anger had replaced some of her fear. She said she was tired of being afraid, tired of accepting cruelty and injustice as just the way things were, tired of being told to be grateful for the smallest scraps of human decency. She said if people were going to hate her anyway, she might as well give them a good reason by standing up for herself and her community. Her words inspired some people and frightened others, but everyone recognized the truth in them. The meeting ended with no clear decision about what to do, but something had shifted in the black community of Redemption Creek. People who had been silent for years started speaking up about mistreatment they had experienced. Black workers who had accepted lower pay without complaint began asking for the same wages as white workers doing the same jobs. The small black church started holding meetings about citizenship rights and voting, topics that had been too dangerous to discuss openly before. Sarah had become a symbol without meaning to, and her courage was giving other people courage too, even as it made the situation more volatile and dangerous for everyone. William Hayes knew that his actions on the street that day had changed his standing in the community, and he had to decide whether to back down or double down on the position he had taken. His business partners and fellow ranchers came to him and expressed their concerns, saying he had set a bad precedent and that black people were getting ideas above their station because of what he had done. Some even threatened to take their business elsewhere if he did not make it clear that his defense of Sarah had been a one-time thing, not a new policy of treating black people as equals. Hayes listened to their arguments and then told them flatly that they could take their business wherever they wanted, but he would not apologize for stopping his son from assaulting a young girl. And if they had a problem with that, then they were the ones in the wrong, not him. Hayes had surprised himself with his own conviction on this issue. He had spent most of his life accepting the racial attitudes of his time and place without much thought, treating black people as inferior, because that was how he had been raised and what everyone around him believed. But seeing his own son acting like a bully and a predator had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths. He thought about the men he had fought alongside in the war, some of whom had been so convinced they were fighting for a noble cause, even as that cause defended the enslavement of human beings. He thought about the world he was leaving to his son, and whether he wanted that world to be one where might made right, and the powerful could abuse the weak without consequence. Something in him had shifted, and while he was not suddenly transformed into a crusader for racial equality, he had drawn a line and he would not step back across it. Hayes did something that shocked the town even more than his original intervention. He rode out to the Mitchell house and asked to speak with Joshua and Grace. When they came to the door, nervous and unsure what this powerful white man wanted with them, Hayes removed his hat and apologized for his son's behavior. He said Thomas had been punished and would not bother Sarah again, and that if anyone else in town gave their family trouble they should come to him and he would handle it. Joshua and Grace did not know what to say, so unused to being treated with this kind of respect by a white person, especially one of Hayes's status. Hayes went further, offering Joshua a job at his ranch doing blacksmith work for better pay than he was currently earning, saying he needed someone with skill, and he did not care what color that person's skin was. It was an offer that would change the Mitchell family's economic situation significantly. And after Hayes left, Joshua and Grace sat in their small house and tried to understand what had just happened and whether it was safe to accept. Not everyone in Redemption Creek was happy about the changes that were starting to happen, and a group of white men began meeting in secret to discuss what they saw as a threat to their way of life. These men represented the worst elements of the town, people who had been bitter about the South's defeat in the war and resentful about the end of slavery. They had formed what they called a citizens' committee, but what was really just a group of angry men looking for someone to blame for their own failures and disappointments. They decided that William Hayes had betrayed them, and that the Mitchell family, particularly Sarah, needed to be taught a lesson that would remind all the black people in town to know their place. The Citizens Committee started a campaign of intimidation and harassment. They spread rumors about the Mitchell family, claiming Joshua was stealing from customers and that Grace was involved in immoral activities. They vandalized the Mitchell house, breaking windows and leaving threatening messages painted on the walls. They pressured white customers to stop using Joshua's blacksmith services, trying to destroy his business and force the family into poverty. And they made it clear that they were watching Sarah, that she had better stop her uppity behavior or there would be serious consequences. The black community rallied around the Mitchells, helping repair the damage and offering what protection they could, but everyone knew that if the Citizens Committee decided to escalate to real violence, there was only so much that could be done to stop them. William Hayes heard about what was happening, and he was furious. He made it known throughout town that anyone who harassed the Mitchell family would answer to him personally, and he started carrying his gun prominently when he came to town, a silent message that he was prepared to back up his words with action if necessary. He hired Joshua to work at his ranch and made sure everyone knew it, effectively putting his own reputation and power behind the Mitchell family. He also went to the sheriff and demanded that the law be enforced equally for everyone in town, that anyone threatening or attacking the Mitchells be arrested and prosecuted. The sheriff, who owed his position partly to Hayes's political support, reluctantly agreed to patrol more actively and warned the members of the Citizens Committee that he would not tolerate vigilante violence in his town. The situation in Redemption Creek was like a powder keg waiting for a spark, and that spark came on a September evening when Sarah was walking home from choir practice at the church. 3 men from the Citizens Committee, their faces covered with bandanas, grabbed her off the street and dragged her toward an alley. Sarah screamed and fought, and her screams were heard by people in nearby houses. What happened next would become legendary in the town's history. Black men came running from their homes with whatever weapons they could grab, determined not to let Sarah be hurt. At the same time, William Hayes happened to be in town and heard the commotion, and he came running too with several of his ranch hands. The would-be attackers found themselves surrounded by an angry group of armed men, both black and white, all united in the purpose of protecting a young girl from harm. The standoff lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours, everyone tense and ready for violence, fingers on triggers and hearts pounding. The 3 attackers realized they were outnumbered and that Hayes himself was there, and they released Sarah and tried to run. But Hayes's ranch hands caught them and pulled off their bandanas, revealing their faces to everyone present. They were not strangers or outsiders but local men, people everyone recognized, including one who worked at the general store and another who was a clerk at the bank. Hayes told them they had exactly 1 day to get out of Redemption Creek and never come back, and if they ever showed their faces in the area again, he would personally make sure they regretted it. The men fled into the night, and the people who had gathered slowly dispersed, but something important had happened in that alley. Black and white people had stood together to protect an innocent person, and they had seen that together they were stronger than the forces of hatred and violence. Sarah was shaken but unharmed, and her parents took her home where she cried tears of fear and relief. But she also felt something new, a sense that maybe things really were changing, that maybe she did not have to live her whole life in fear of people who hated her for her skin color. The black community of Redemption Creek felt it too, this cautious hope that perhaps they were not as powerless as they had always believed, that perhaps they had allies among white people like Hayes and his ranch hands who were willing to stand with them when it mattered most. And the white community had to grapple with uncomfortable questions about what kind of town they wanted to live in, and whether the old ways of hatred and intimidation were really worth preserving. In the months that followed, Redemption Creek began to change in small but meaningful ways. The library was opened, and Sarah was one of its most frequent visitors, spending hours reading books on history and literature and science. William Hayes personally donated money to buy books for the library's collection, and he insisted that it be open to everyone in town, regardless of race. Some white people objected and refused to use a library that allowed black people inside, but others decided that access to knowledge was more important than maintaining old prejudices. The library became a symbol of what the town could be, a place where people came together for learning and betterment rather than division. Joshua Mitchell's blacksmith business thrived working for Hayes, and with the increased income, he was able to expand his services and hire an assistant, a young black man who needed training and opportunity. Grace Mitchell was hired by several white families who appreciated her skill with sewing and were willing to pay fair prices for her work. The Mitchell family moved to a bigger house in a better part of town, and while some neighbors were unhappy about having black people move into their neighborhood, Hayes made it clear that anyone who harassed the Mitchells would lose his goodwill, and that was enough to keep most people civil. Sarah continued her education with renewed determination, and Mrs. Patterson began talking about helping her apply to one of the new colleges for black students that were opening in the South. The changes were not smooth or easy, and there was resistance and backsliding and moments when it seemed like the old hatreds would win out. But something fundamental had shifted in Redemption Creek, a recognition that people had a choice about what kind of community they would build and what values they would uphold. Sarah's courage in speaking up and refusing to be silenced had been the catalyst, and Hayes's willingness to use his power for justice, rather than just for his own benefit, had made real change possible. Together, they had shown that the Wild West did not have to be a place where might made right, where the strong preyed on the weak without consequence. It could also be a place where courage and principle mattered, where people stood up for each other, where a better future was possible if enough people were brave enough to fight for it. Sarah Mitchell did eventually go to college, one of the first black women from Texas to attend the new school for black students that opened in Atlanta. She studied to become a teacher, just as she had always dreamed, and when she finished her education, she returned to Texas and opened a school for black children that served not just Redemption Creek, but the entire surrounding area. She taught for more than 40 years, educating hundreds of students and inspiring many of them to pursue their own dreams of education and advancement. She never forgot the terror of that day when Thomas Hayes grabbed her arm, or the surprise and relief when his father intervened, or the night when an entire community came together to protect her from violence. Those experiences shaped her understanding of human nature, teaching her that people were capable of both great cruelty and great courage, and that the difference often came down to individual choices in crucial moments. William Hayes never became a crusader for racial equality in any public way, but his actions in defending Sarah and supporting the Mitchell family had ripple effects that went far beyond what he probably intended. His willingness to use his power to protect rather than oppress set an example that other influential people in the area noticed and sometimes followed. His ranch became known as a place where black cowboys and workers were treated fairly and paid decent wages, and that reputation helped attract good workers and built loyalty that paid dividends to his business. His son Thomas, after the humiliation of being publicly disciplined by his father, eventually left Texas and was never heard from again in Redemption Creek. And Hayes always carried some sadness about how his son had turned out, but he never regretted the choice he made that day on the street. The story of what happened in Redemption Creek became known throughout Texas and beyond, carried by travelers and newspapers and letters that spread the tale of a black girl's courage and a white rancher's unexpected defense of justice. The story was told different ways by different people, some emphasizing the drama and danger, others focusing on the moral lessons, but all versions captured something important about a moment when ordinary people were forced to decide what they stood for and who they were willing to become. The town itself prospered over the years, growing from a small frontier settlement into a substantial community. And while it never became completely free of racial prejudice and conflict, it was better than many places in the South because of what had happened that summer and the choices people made in response. The story of Sarah Mitchell and William Hayes in Redemption Creek is ultimately a story about moral courage and the power of standing up for what is right even when it is difficult and dangerous. When Sarah pleaded for Thomas Hayes to stop his assault and said that what he was doing was forbidden, she was not just talking about one boy grabbing her arm. She was talking about a whole system of injustice and oppression that treated black people as less than human, that allowed white people to abuse and exploit them without consequence, that tried to crush the spirits and aspirations of anyone who dared to dream of something better. Her plea was forbidden because speaking up against injustice was considered dangerous and inappropriate for a black girl in the 1870s, because she was supposed to accept her mistreatment silently and be grateful she was not suffering something worse. William Hayes's decision not to stop, not to walk away and pretend he had not seen what his son was doing, was equally significant. He could have protected his son and preserved his own standing with the people who shared his racial prejudices. He could have looked the other way and let Sarah suffer because helping her would complicate his life and challenge his assumptions about the world. But he chose differently, and that choice required a kind of courage that is often overlooked in stories about the Wild West that focus on gunfights and cattle drives. The courage to admit you might have been wrong, the courage to stand up to your own community when they are acting unjustly, the courage to use your power and privilege to protect someone weaker rather than to exploit them. These are forms of bravery that build civilization rather than just conquering territory. What erupted in Redemption Creek after Hayes refused to stop defending Sarah was not just anger from white supremacists or gratitude from the black community, though both of those things happened. What truly erupted was a conversation about values and the kind of society people wanted to build in this new land. The frontier offered opportunities to start fresh, to leave behind some of the old hatreds and hierarchies of the settled East, but it also brought out the worst in people who thought they could act without restraint or consequence in places where law and civilization were still being established. Sarah and Hayes together showed that the frontier could be a place where justice mattered, where courage was not just about fighting outlaws, but about standing up for human dignity, where community meant protecting all members, not just those who looked like you or had the same amount of power as you. Their story echoes through history as a reminder that change is always possible if enough people are willing to take risks for what they believe is right. It shows that individuals matter, that one girl's courage to speak up and one man's decision to listen and act can shift the course of an entire community. It proves that allies are essential, that oppressed people need those with power and privilege to stand with them if real change is going to happen, and that sometimes those allies come from unexpected places. And it demonstrates that the arc of justice does not bend on its own toward fairness and equality, but must be pulled in that direction by human hands, by people who refuse to accept cruelty and injustice as inevitable, by those who are brave enough to say this is forbidden and mean it with every fiber of their being. Sarah Mitchell pleaded for things to change. William Hayes chose not to ignore that plea, and together they helped a town erupt not into violence and destruction, but into difficult, messy, imperfect progress toward a more just future. Their legacy lived on in every student Sarah taught, in every worker Hayes treated fairly, and in every person who heard their story and decided that they too could be brave when the moment called for it.